Okay, good morning. My name is Bill Hollings. I'm the lead developer at the Brandwell Workshop, who created MoltenVK. And I'm currently the lead developer and principal maintaining MoltenVK. Okay, I thought I'd start with a brief history of how we got here. So back when the smartphone revolution was starting up, back in 2009, I think I bought my first iOS phone, and we were working on a game actually that actually never materialized. But what materialized was the engine that drove that game, because back in that day, like even Unity and people like that had either no support or terrible support for iOS. So we developed this game called, this engine called Khronos 3D, which is an offshoot of Khronos 2D. It was written in Objective-C back in those days. Then when Metal came out in 2014, people started asking us, oh, can we improve this engine speed, performance by moving to Metal? So we started looking into moving to Metal as a sort of a secondary backend. It was on OpenGL ES2. And in doing that, we realized that because our engine was an offshoot of another engine, it was going to get really messy to try to plug in secondary back ends onto our engine. So came up with the idea of, instead of doing that, let's just let the OpenGL run through the actual engine and then output to Metal. So hence we ended up with this layer called MoltenGL, which still exists. It's a proprietary. We sell it for a license, and companies use it to protect against Apple's deprecation of OpenGL ES for their games. There's legacy games. The thing about the game industry, as you all know, people play 20-year-old games all the time. So there's lots of legacy games out there that people are still playing. The publishers of those games don't want to invest in a Metal backend because the game is just being maintained and not rebuilt or anything like that. So they use something like MoltenGL to basically guard themselves against losing a market if Apple decides tomorrow we're done with OpenGL. After that, so that was in 2014. The MoltenGL layer came out in 2015, as I say there. That was also coincident with Vulkan starting up. And so in talking to people and in the industry and things like that, we had this suggestion made to us: why don't you guys do the same exact thing but with Vulkan? Because we all know Apple's never going to implement Vulkan. It was very clear in those days that Apple was on their way out of trying to be supporting open standards. So we did. So then the next year we published the first version of MoltenVK. Just shortly after, so it was really good timing because it was just shortly after Vulkan came out in the beginning of 2016. We worked with a few people in the industry, most importantly Valve. They got very interested in MoltenVK because Valve is heavily invested in the Vulkan environment. The Vulkan probably wouldn't exist if Valve hadn't been pushing it right from the start. That's a broad statement, and I'm sure a lot of people would argue me that. But they are very heavily invested in making sure that Vulkan survives. And so they got involved in funding us to continue developing. And then in 2018, Brandwell Workshop actually sold MoltenVK to Valve, and Valve open sourced it. And they continue to fund my work on it, as well as some of the LunarG stuff that Richard was talking as well on on supporting it. And then around that time too, Codeweavers, who, for those of you who are not familiar with them, their goal is to allow Windows apps to run on Apple environments. They produce a product called Crossover that does that. They're very heavily involved in Wine for both Linux and Mac. And they have been a very significant contributor to the MoltenVK code base since 2018. Now this is a crazy slide, but it shows you the current state of cross API layering. Chris talked about a little bit about this, not this particular slide, but about the concept in his keynote, and Richard talked about it a little bit here. So this kind of summarizes where we are in the industry, and it shows that MoltenVK down in the bottom left there is one of many layering options that everybody has in the industry when they're trying to take one game from one platform and move it over to, or game or app, and move it over to another platform. So the highlighted red row shows you going from, or at least I should explain, as they say over there, if you want to go, where you're going from is on the top, and where you're going to, your source is on the top, your destination is on the bottom. So MoltenVK is showing you going from Vulkan to Metal. But if you want, you can go from OpenGL using Angle to get to Vulkan. You can go, there's our other product, MoltenGL on the bottom there, going from OpenGL to Metal. As you can see, the row and the column with Vulkan in there are full, which means Vulkan can be used as a middle API to get really from any other API to any other API. So you can do crazy things like you can go OpenGL through Zinc to get to Vulkan, and then go take that Vulkan and run it through Ashes to get back to OpenGL. If you have a hankering for unnecessary layering. So it's really quite remarkable that you can really go. The industry is wide open right now in terms of allowing you to do that. And as you can see, Richard didn't name them, but I'll name them. All of the DX12 row there, Microsoft has jumped in the game. They just released something called Dozen, which allows you to go from Vulkan layering over DX12. So even they see the value and the usefulness and the capacity to use layering effectively to go from one API to another on a platform. So the current status of MoltenVK is we support Vulkan 1.2 with a whole bunch of extensions. We are on our way to 1.3, but it'll take a little time. As Richard explains, MoltenVK is embedded for Mac. MoltenVK for Mac is embedded in the Vulkan SDK. There is no Vulkan SDK for iOS. So if you're building an iOS app, then you just embed MoltenVK directly without the SDK components of the loader and layers. We're a key component of the Vulkan Portability Initiative. The Vulkan Portability Initiative is really, if we go back to that slide with all the crisscrossing on it, showing layering, it's a subgroup of the Vulkan group, which is really about trying to figure out, how do we allow Vulkan to run on as many platforms as possible, some of which don't have the capability, like the Apple products, of having a native driver. We are currently undergoing extensive activities to test MoltenVK to try to get it to conformance. Right now, I'll talk about this a little later, but we are well on the way. We're very close to conformance at certain levels. Vulkan 1.0, Vulkan 1.2, where we're currently at in terms of overall functionality. We're a little further away from conformance, but heading in the right direction. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. We get most of our improvements from feedback from developers. So CTS testing gets us, functionality and things like that. It's a very good tool to pull out where we're not fully conformant. But in a lot of cases, even with conformance, sometimes we'll run into issues where other drivers behave differently than MoltenVK, and so that feedback comes from users like you guys. Also, in terms of prioritizing, like if you're really keen to see a new feature or an enhancement added, getting feedback on the issues list is really helpful there. So we're really customer driven. One of the things about being an open source project is I have no idea who my customers are. I'll go into a little detail later. So, we definitely welcome input. If you're building an app and have questions, please contact us. If you're building an app and don't have questions and everything's working great, please contact us about that too. So we are an open source project, as I mentioned, with a very small team. As I mentioned, Valve funds me personally to be full-time on MoltenVK. Other than that, CodeWeavers, as I mentioned, has contributed quite a bit of code to support. They do it basically as they are porting a game over. They will contribute code to say, oh, we needed to change this in order to get this game running, or this game has this game port has highlighted a variance in MoltenVK, and we fixed it up, that kind of thing. Also, developers like you have contributed to the code base as well on a as needed basis. When you run into a problem running your game and you realize, oh geez, MoltenVK is not doing this correctly or doesn't support this extension, so we've got extensions added through somebody who's just trying to run a game or an app on MoltenVK. So once again, please continue to do that, because it's an open source environment and we welcome contributions from everything. So because we're a small team, we're generally behind the curve. We're always playing catch up in terms of the spec. Currently, we're at 1.2 plus extensions. The main specification, as everybody knows, is at 1.3. It generally, our history so far has been we're about 2 years behind. So, we got to 1.2 2 years after it was officially published. We got to 1.1 2 years after it was officially published. So again, more contributions from the community would help us get up there quicker. We do have lots of extensions, but some of the more snazzy and modern, but large ones that we've been talking about this conference, like video, mesh shaders, and ray tracing, are missing. Those are, and because they're modern and new, and because they require a fair bit of work, that's fundamentally why they're missing. In the case, there's also issues with, how does metal perform or behave in terms of some of those features compared to the Vulkan specification, and those will get fleshed out as we start to work on that. But if anybody's interested in saying, wow, I really need ray tracing, or I really need mesh shaders, once again, please start to talk to us. We can try to set up projects and get you contributing. We will get there, but as I say, the more hands, the merrier, and the faster we go. But despite this, despite all of that I was just talking about, we are actually very close to conformance. At 1.0, running the million or so tests, we pass 174,000 of them, and we fail about 200 right now. So we're very close to conformance there. Part of what Richard was talking about with the portability subset will take care of almost all of those 200. So we'll be adding new flags to that portability subset when it goes final, that will remove a bunch of those failures and move them to not supported. as opposed to failures. So we'll end up with about 174,000 of them passing. The rest of the million are basically not supported because it's Vulkan 1.0. When we get up to Vulkan 1.2 with all the extensions we currently support, we're passing about 322,000 tests, and we've got about 10K or about 3.3% of the tests are failing. That's just as an indication that we haven't been focusing on CTS for 1.2 yet because we've been focusing on 1.1 or 1.0, but we will get there. Oh, and I missed that thing about AAA titles there. Some titles definitely hit limits in terms of functionality. If you've got a AAA game that's doing ray tracing, we're not going to be able to run it, et cetera, et cetera. So they do. We do encounter limits where very sophisticated apps who are running very modern features, Vulkan features, they do hit limits in terms of functionality. Binary ports where we're going, we're literally trying to run a Windows app in a Windows environment on Wine. By the time it gets down to MoltenVK, where we're trying to, it's gone through a conversion through DXVK or whatever. Sometimes we hit issues there just because of the mapping of features. Now, a lot of those can be fixed, so it's a matter of just identifying it. I'm telling you sort of where we're hitting them. Other than that, as many of you know, MoltenVK works great in terms of that. And the problems only come about on those small few apps where they're really testing and stretching Vulkan. As Chris mentioned earlier on his keynote and the slide where all those layering options that I presented, layering itself is very lightweight. So people always ask me, oh my God, you got this layer in there, it must be slowing my game down incredibly. For the most part, no. The layering is not the problem. Layering is very lightweight. And as Chris said, these days with solid processing and high speed and CPU versus GPU binding or limiting, the layering is not the problem. So MoltenVK performs really good, really well in terms of performance. It doesn't add much to the mix in terms of performance concerns. Where we do encounter issues, or where you may, is just in how the app uses Vulkan. So for instance, and how that then maps to metal. So for instance, what have we got there? Like metal is a higher level language. So if your app is really fine tuning barriers and things like that, if you're really getting down to the nitty gritty and trying to tune, get the last little drips of performance out of your Vulkan app, because metal is a higher level language in terms of it kind of goes back to the old days of OpenGL where it's trying to optimize under the covers as opposed to letting you fine tune. You will find some performance hit there. As I indicate there. Also, the shaders, fundamentally, we're going from SpearV to metal shading language. We're doing a transpilation stage there. Sometimes that doesn't always work out in terms of optimal performance because if you compare it to like handcrafted metal code, metal shading language code. We are committed to improving everything, of course. So sometimes we'll get issues showing up in the MoltenVK repo issues list, talking about performance and saying, "Oh, we've got we've hit a roadblock here in terms of performance." Sometimes it turns out to be fixable in MoltenVK. Sometimes we can optimize the shading conversion. So again, feedback is important, and definitely support that. As with the other side, the same people encounter performance limits. AAA games that are tuning the heck out of their game when it comes to running on MoltenVK, it can sometimes, they're the ones that are going to hit performance limits. For the most part, as a lot of you know, it works fine. A couple of areas that where, for instance, the metal does not perform the way Vulkan performs. Things like draw and direct with count. That's an example of something that does not exist in metal. So what we end up having to do is, if you send in, I want to draw and direct with 100 instances, we actually have to cycle through those 100 instances on the CPU and submit 100 draw calls. So that's an example of where an app is using something that MoltenVK can do, because it's going to do that cycling for you, but it's not optimal. And tessellation is another example where it works really well, but it's not as performant on metal because of the way Vulkan handles tessellation compared to the way metal handles tessellation. Metal requires a compute stage, which means you're breaking up your render pass into a compute and a render phase, and that organization, the comparison between how Vulkan handles it versus metal handles it, ends up making it not as performant as it could be. If you've been wondering why LunarG asks you to fill out those surveys, here's why. It's very useful. It's wonderful to see, for instance, that upwards of 20 to 30% of game developers and users of Vulkan are actively working on the iOS and macOS platforms, which encourages us and quite a bit. On the left, no, you're right. There's sort of a high-level picture of imagery of some of the users of MoltenVK. And I'll go into the next slide, which is a much more detailed view of that. So we've got a whole bunch of games running on MoltenVK on Mac, typically. Some of those you'll recognize. I just added a couple from this conference. Wreckfest and Victoria 3 there are I was unaware of. And this goes back to, I was saying, with an open source environment, I don't have any formal clients. I don't have customers who I'm invoicing and they're registering their names and things like that. With MoltenVK, as you know, you just download it. I have no idea that you've downloaded it. All of a sudden, the only thing I ever hear about is somebody tells me about it, like at a conference like this, or they end up running into problems and start submitting code, or they have post to the issues list. So sometimes I only hear about that you're working on an app or a game because something's gone wrong. So we got a whole bunch of games. The middle section there, games runnable via crossover. Those are using MoltenVK through Wine under the covers. So those games there, the developer of the game doesn't use MoltenVK, but when crossover is using it to run that Windows game, so as far as the developer is concerned, they just wrote a Windows game. Somebody else has then said, oh, let's try running that through Wine and putting, which includes MoltenVK under the covers. And all of those games there were never designed for MoltenVK, never designed for Mac, but they are runnable on the platform through Wine and MoltenVK. If you're interested in terms of seeing some of this in action, in the top right corner there, I've got a link that to a review somebody did on YouTube, where they're showing, here's the game running, and here's how I had to tweak maybe some of the settings in order to get it to run really well. It talks about, some of the just the capabilities, and they were quite impressed with MoltenVK, and it was kind of neat to see somebody actually running through 15 different games that were running on Mac because MoltenVK was supporting it. In addition, we've got applications that have nothing to do with games, like a couple of Autodesk, sorry, I'm almost done. A couple of Autodesk apps. And I understand there's several companies here using MoltenVK that are not running games, or not building games, they're building apps, and I'd love to hear about that. We'll add you to the list there. We've got engines running MoltenVK as well, specifically to run other apps. And also, surprisingly, a number of platform emulators, everything from the Google Android emulator running on Mac to PS2 emulators are finding success with MoltenVK. And finally, I won't go into this too much, but Metal 3 came out last year. People always ask me that because it added a bunch of features, so things like mesh shaders. So there's lots of opportunity for us to get things done, move into the future. Buffer device addresses are finally available on Metal. Okay, and that's everything. So thanks for listening, and if anybody's got any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Richard answered them all.
The translation of Spirit for the shaders. Yep. Is there a way to link cost of that? So cache the translation.
Yep.
Or can I feed shaders directly?
Yep. Yeah. So for the past several years, pipeline caching, what we do is we avoid that, because what we do is we store the metal shading language version of it. So when we pull it back in, and now that Metal supports binary archives, we're going to try to optimize that even further. So the actual pipeline, hopefully, itself will also be stored.
If I'm able to compile it straight into the metal shading, could I feed it directly?
Yes, yeah, you can. It's not heavily used, but yes, you technically can. You can, and when you create a VK module, shader module, thank you. When you create that, you can, in the source code, you can actually pass in SPIR-V, you can pass in metal shading language source code, or you can pass in a compiled shader. Now the issue there becomes, how do you then link that to the descriptors and things like that? So you have to be kind of careful and diligent in doing that. When you just pass in SPIR-V, we take care of all of it. But if you created a compiled metal shader that you say, oh, buffer 1 is this buffer, then you just have to be really careful on how you line those up, so that MoltenVK understands the same descriptor indexing. Yep.
Do you know something about RenderDoc support?
To be honest, no, I haven't actually tried to run RenderDoc on it. For performance and tracing, typically we'd use the actual Metal tools for that, because then you're getting right down into what the actual GPU is doing. So because Metal, so that's actually one of the benefits of MoltenVK, is that we do support, so you can do a GPU capture like as any Metal app would run. You can do performance analysis as any Metal app. And because it's running Metal, you get all the details that app will provide. So typically that's where we go when we want to dig into the guts. But in principle, it's Vulkan, so RenderDoc probably will run it just fine. Yep.
First of all, just thank you for your work. MoltenVK, doing whatever mind reading you need to do to read the app.
You're welcome.
I was curious to learn if there was a MoltenGL before. I assume Molten play on the
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. So interesting. What happened is, going back to that original history slide. So yeah, we came out with MoltenGL first. We called it MetalGL, and then when that's an obvious connection. And then when MoltenVK, the first version of MoltenVK was actually called MetalVK. We got a nice little friendly letter from Apple saying, "Hey, we're really happy that you're using Metal, but you can't use the name in your name." And that was totally understandable. It's a trademark of theirs. You know, they don't want us crapping all over the industry, you know, being a terrible product and invoking their name. As it turns out, we're a great product, so they probably wouldn't care. But you know, their lawyers had something to say about that. So in doing that, we said, you know, oh, how are we going to rename this? And we came up with Molten because of Vulkan, and then we just backpedaled that into Molten GL as well. Good observation. Yep. So I haven't, the question is, if I understand, and correct me if I'm wrong, the question is, you know, have we looked into how we would do the video extension on Metal? The answer to that is no. I haven't got into the level of detail of that yet. I was actually fervently taking notes while the video presentations were going on this afternoon, because in understanding how Vulkan handles it, and then we'd have to look at how Metal handles it. Metal doesn't formally handle video. So things like when we talk about loading a command buffer with a command, that will be a challenge because there's no, as far as I know, there's no equivalent to Metal. So we'd have to be doing some certain amount of emulation around that, I'm sure. So it'll be an interesting experiment. And if anybody wants to work with us on that, please join the fray, and we'll set up a side thing. So I'm being kicked off the stage here. I'll be here past 4 o'clock. So if anybody wants to ask me more questions, or if you've got you've had a successful experience with MoltenVK on your app, please come and tell me about it.